One of the most baffling parts about the coverage of the Democratic primary going on right now has been the over-reliance on the polls. Now, I want to make something clear. What the polls show are where the candidates currently place in any specific given poll. At best, if you look at the aggregate of polls, they can show you a trend of what's happening in the race. What the polls don't show is how likely a candidate is to win the primary. If you're looking for the answer to that question, I'd say there are several different factors that are more important and better indicators as to a candidate's chances of winning the primary. And some of those indicators would be, how many individual donors do you have? That is a big sign of how much people really relate to your campaign. How much do the regular working class people, the voters in this primary, connect with what you're saying and believe in you enough to give you their hard-earned money? Another more important factor is, how many volunteers do you have? What is your ground game looking like? How does the grassroots of your campaign measure up with everyone else's? Another incredibly important indicator as to someone's chances of winning the primary is their policies. What policies do you support? Are they policies that the majority of the party and the country support? More than that, are you consistent in those policies positions? How long have you been fighting for those policy priorities? Do you mean it, or are you doing it for political expediency? Are you doing it because you think that's what the voters want to hear? And another huge factor in determining a candidate's chances in winning the nomination, how big are your crowd sizes? Are you selling out stadiums? Are you having lines outside the door down the block every time you give a speech or do a campaign rally? Or are you someone like Joe Biden who can barely get together 5 people for a campaign event? Those are huge indicators to determine whether or not a candidate is likely to win the nomination. Because I weigh those factors more than the flawed and inaccurate polling coming from these polling agencies, because of that, my position is and always has been that Bernie Sanders is the clear front runner in the Democratic primary. I have never once said that Joe Biden is a front runner in the Democratic primary, regardless of what the polls are saying. Because to say that Joe Biden is the front runner, you'd have to be basing that off of literally nothing else but polling. You have to completely disregard all the other factors that I mentioned before: the policies, the crowd size, the amount of individual donors you have, your grassroots volunteer network, on top of ignoring all those other important factors where Joe Biden clearly falls short of Bernie Sanders. But you'd also be ignoring the fact that Joe Biden is just a uniquely bad candidate. Joe Biden has always been known to say stupid shit and put his foot in his mouth on a regular basis. He's basically like the Trump of the Democratic Party. And now one of the developments of the primary has been that it appears that Joe Biden is getting senile. So he's saying even more incoherent things. He doesn't know where he is on the campaign trail. He doesn't remember when he graduated. He doesn't remember when he got engaged to his wife. He's mixing up words and phrases and doing incoherent rambling at rallies and speeches all the time, almost on a daily basis. His campaign and his supporters are noticing this and pointing it out in the media. You'd have to ignore all of those factors and simply look at the polling that says Joe Biden is up and he has a 15-20 point lead on Bernie Sanders, who's in number 2. So I guess my question is, when do people stop giving these polls so much credibility? Because it seems like in the world of political commentary, the worst thing you can possibly be called in 2019 is a poll denier or a poll truther. But my counter to that is, at what point do these polling agencies lose credibility? Because if I were to come out and say, all right, I did a poll, it's a scientific poll, polled 1,500 people, try to make sure the demographics were in line with the country, So I did this polling of the primary, here are the results, but before you read the results, let me tell you, there may be a 20-point margin of error for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders might actually overperform this poll by 20 to 30%. So whatever, just here's the poll, you can analyze it, do with it what you will, but just know there's a 20-point margin of error and Bernie Sanders might actually be up 20 more points than that poll says. If I did that, everyone would look at me and laugh and there would be universal mockery, and I would deserve that, because how are you going to call that poll credible when there's a 20-point margin of error? It could go 20 points in either direction. The front runner could be up by 20 points or he could be tied with second place. That's not a serious poll. You're not giving anybody hard, concrete information. You're not giving anybody hard, concrete data. What that is you guessing. But for some reason, if a polling agency puts out a poll and says, yeah, it's a scientific poll 1,500 people, the demographics are in line with the country, there's a 2-point margin of error, and they keep putting out those polls, and those polls remain consistent all the way up till the voting happens. And when the voting happens, those polls that we were looking at back in September and in August and July and June, they were off by 20%. Nobody's ever going to turn around and say, whoa, goddamn, these polling agencies seem to be way off. Maybe we shouldn't be putting so much weight into their polling data. Maybe that shouldn't be what we're determining who has the best chance to win the nomination, because 20 points is that's a big difference. You can't be 20 points off in any other profession and still claim to be good at your job. But the polling agencies, they can have progressives down by 20. They can have Bernie Sanders down by 20, like they did all in the 2016 primary. And there's no price to pay for it. There's no reckoning with the fact that they were just dead wrong. Instead, everybody was just like, oh, nothing to see here. Better luck next time. I don't know. That just, it's bizarre to me. That's bizarre. Now, again, I'm not saying dismiss every single poll you ever read ever, but all I'm saying is, at the very least, in the Democratic primary, in Democratic primaries, when there's a progressive running, those polls are not going to show you what the voting is going to actually look like. That has been proven over and over and over again. So again, for anyone to say that Joe Biden is the front runner, you literally have to ignore every other factor and just be looking at the polling. And I think that's crazy. That's ludicrous for several different reasons. And I'm going to get to all of them. So let's talk about the inaccuracy of these polls. It's safe to assume that what the polls are showing right now aren't going to be reflected when we start actually voting in the primary, because it's been proven in 2016 and again in 2018 that Democratic primary polls simply cannot account for how much progressives and real leftists overperform in primaries. The reason why progressives overperform the polls is fairly simple. It comes down to two factors, really. One is the fact that their message resonates with people. So people hear them actually fighting for policies that they want. $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, so universal health care, free college, ending the wars. People hear those things, and those policy positions are overwhelmingly popular. So people who are usually not interested in politics because the only choices are establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans who are fairly similar on policy, when people hear a progressive like Bernie Sanders saying, I'm the opposite of both of these parties, I don't agree with any of them, I'm with you. When people hear that, they come out to vote, and in record-breaking numbers. And also, some of the people who do come out and vote for that progressive are younger people who it would be their first time voting in an election. And it's because of this, the polling agencies, whether it's intentional or not, they don't end up actually polling the people who will vote in the election. They poll people who are likely voters, people who usually come out and vote in elections, regardless if the only options are establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans. And those people are usually older people, conservative voters, who are more likely to answer a poll saying, yeah, I support the establishment candidate, the conservative Democrat candidate. So intentional or not, the polling agencies oversample older people. And when you oversample older people, it skews the poll in favor of the centrist Democrat, the establishment Democrat. But when the voting actually comes around, the progressive has so many people, first-time voters and people who aren't usually into politics coming out to vote for them, that they way overperform, because those people weren't ever asked by pollsters, hey, who are you going to vote for? They don't ask 18-year-olds in polls who are you going to vote for. They don't ask people, adults who've never voted before in their life, hey, who are you going to vote for? No, they go by the voting rolls. They go by who's registered as a Democrat and who usually votes in primaries and in elections. I mean, look at the 2016 primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Did you know that as late as October or November in 2015, so even further along into the primary season than we are right now, the polls had Bernie Sanders down in Iowa anywhere from about 20 points to 30 points, some of them even as high as 40 points. He was down 20 to 30 points in Iowa polling. Well, when the Iowa caucuses came around in January of 2016, Bernie Sanders overperformed the polls, closed that gap, and Hillary Clinton barely eked out a victory in Iowa. I believe she won. It was like a 1 percentage point difference in the vote total. She barely won Iowa. And mind you, this is in the middle of the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and the mainstream media rigging the primary so that Hillary Clinton would be the nominee. And that's not my opinion, it's not my conjecture. Their own emails that got leaked prove that. And the DNC's lawyers in court admitted that's what was happening. So with all of that, Bernie Sanders was down in the polls 20 to 30 points in Iowa. But when the voting happened, when the caucus happened, he closed that gap and ends up losing by 1 point, even with the whole shit being rigged against him. In New Hampshire, around this time in the primary in 2015, but around this time in the 2016 Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders was polling around 37% in New Hampshire, and Hillary Clinton was beating him, and that was fairly consistent throughout the polls. When the voting actually came around early February, Bernie Sanders blew Hillary Clinton out. It was a blowout. He won by 23 points. He had like 60% of the vote. Hillary Clinton had 37% of the vote. And again, Democratic Party juggernaut, party insider, the Democratic Party, the DNC, the media, New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, they were all already rigging the primary for Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders still overperformed the polls, and he still managed to blow her ass out. In Michigan, that was literally the biggest upset in primary history. I believe that night, the night of the voting, the day of the voting, the polls had Bernie Sanders down about 20% on against Hillary Clinton. It was going to be a bloodbath if you listen to the mainstream media and if you listen to the polling organizations. Well, when the voting happened, again, this was literally primary history, the biggest upset in primary history. Bernie Sanders closed that 20-point gap and ended up winning Michigan against Hillary Clinton. And again, the polling all showed him down at least 20 points. I'm sure it's more than that if you go back to September, October of 2015. I'm sure he was down more than 20%. But on the day of voting, polls showed him down 20%, and he overperformed, closed that gap, and ended up beating Hillary Clinton in Michigan. Biggest upset in primary history. If you look at the overall primary, at this point, Bernie Sanders was polling, 20% in the national polls? By the end of the primary, Bernie Sanders won over 20 states and 48% of the vote, 48 or 47% of the vote. Does that look like the work of someone who's polling at 20%? Bernie Sanders closed that gap, almost got as many votes as Hillary Clinton, almost won as many states as Hillary Clinton, all with the DNC and the media rigging the primary so that Hillary Clinton would be the nominee. If there was ever a candidate or politician who broke the mold and made polling obsolete and nearly irrelevant, it would be Bernie Sanders. But here's the thing, like I mentioned earlier, it's not just Bernie Sanders. I have a list of other progressives since his movement started in 2015 who have also overperformed primary polls. You have Paula Jean Swearengin in West Virginia, who was running against Joe Manchin for his Senate seat in the 2018 midterms. Paula Jean Swearengin was a nobody. She was a coal miner's daughter. She had no political clout. She didn't come from money. The most she was involved in politics was campaigning for Bernie Sanders, I believe, in 2016. So she's running in the 2018 she's running in the primary against Joe Manchin. She's a Justice Democrat. So even with the entire Democratic Party backing Joe Manchin, even with all the big donors backing Joe Manchin getting all the media coverage, Joe Manchin having all the name recognition in the world in West Virginia, even with Joe Manchin outraising Paula Jean Swearengin 45-1. 45-1, that's not an exaggeration. He raised so much corporate cash, he outraised her 45-1. I believe he had $9 million. He raised $9 million for his campaign. Paula Jean Swearengin had $200,000. Even with all the advantages that Joe Manchin had, the polling in the primary, and there wasn't much polling done in the primary, but I believe the very few polls that were done had Paula Jean barely at 10%, even if she was even at 10%. Well, how did she perform when the voting actually came around? Paula Jean Swearengin, that nobody from West Virginia, that coal miner's daughter, got 30% of the vote on Joe Manchin's ass. Joe Manchin, like I said, outraised her 45-1, $9 million to $200,000. Now, even though he did get a large amount of the vote, he got like 70% of the vote to her 30%. That is still such a huge difference between what the polling was saying, which was that she'd be lucky if she got 10% of the vote, to her actually getting 30% against a well-known incumbent who had the backing of the Democratic Party, the media, and the big donors. And that's just an example of progressives overperforming and still ending up losing in the primary. Look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. When she was running against Joe Crowley, nobody thought she was going to win. The mainstream media ignored her. Joe Crowley was also the head of the Democratic Party in Queens, so he was using that to his advantage and tipping the primaries in his favor. And of course, since he was one of the highest ranking Democrats in the entire country, he had the backing of all the big corporate donors. Outraised Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez 10-1. He raised $3 million to her, I believe, $300,000. And again, there wasn't much polling done, but I believe the polling that was shown had AOC down 30 points, 40 points to Joe Crowley. How did it turn out when the voting actually came around? AOC turns around and almost beats Joe Crowley in a landslide. She got 56% of the vote and Joe Crowley got 43% of the vote. 13%. So she overcome a 30 to 40% difference in the poll and then overperformed that and beat Joe Crowley by 13% of the vote. Andrew Gillum in Florida, he had relatively the least name recognition of all the Democrats running in the governor's race. There were many more prominent establishment centrist Democrats running. They had the backing of all the billionaires and the millionaires and the big donors and the corporations. And all the polling had Andrew Gillum in like dead last. Some of the polling, at best, he was polling at like 12%. Some of the polling had him at even lower than 10%. Well, when the actual voting came around and the voters went to the booth, Andrew Gillum won the nomination, running on Medicare for all and $15 minimum wage. Now, we can question Andrew Gillum, how committed he actually is to progressive policies, but he ran as a progressive in that primary, and because of that, he overperformed those polls massively to win the nomination. And these are just a few examples. There were hundreds of candidates running in Our Revolution and Justice Democrats, and a lot of them overperformed their primary polls. Now, some of them might have lost their primary, but they still overperformed their polls. Some of them might have won their primaries and lost the general election, but they still overperformed their primary poll. That's the point I'm trying to make. the actual margin of error in these polls is too wide for people to be giving these polls so much credibility. If you want to judge how someone's going to do in the primary, like I said, you have other more important factors that you need to weigh. How many individual donors does a candidate have? How much has a candidate raised from those individual donors? How big are their crowd sizes? Are they selling out arenas? Are they selling out stadiums? Are they selling out venues? Are there lines out the door and all the way down the block? That's important. What are the candidates' policies? Do you have policies that are overwhelmingly popular? Do you raising the minimum wage polls at 70, 80%? If you support that, you have a pretty good chance of winning. Are you in favor of Medicare for all? Medicare for all polls 60 to 70%. If you support that, you have a good chance of winning. And also, your grassroots organizing. What's your ground game look like? Do you have the volunteers to go state to state, city to city, and really make an impact, to really reach people, knock on doors, and convince people to vote for you? Do you have that grassroots network? And bringing it back to the primary, when you take those factors into account, I don't see how anyone other than Bernie Sanders is the front runner. And that has been true since the day he got into the race. He has the most individual donors. Nobody's even close. He broke records, and he continues to break records for the amount of money he's raising. And that's especially telling since he's not raising any money from corporations or millionaires and billionaires. So this whole time, the myth in the Democratic Party is we can't get off this corporate cash because then we won't be able to raise enough money to win elections. While Bernie Sanders is showing he can outraise anybody raising corporate cash just by his individual donors. And that's a good sign that he's going to have people come out to vote for him. And another great sign that he's going to have people come out and vote for him. In less than a week of announcing his campaign, he had over 1 million volunteers sign up to volunteer for his campaign. That is unheard of. That is unprecedented. Nobody ever in the history of electoral politics has ever had 1 million people sign up to volunteer for their campaign within a week. That is fucking crazy. That was months ago now. Can you imagine how many people he has signed up to volunteer right now? And that number is only going to keep growing. It's going to keep growing all the way up until the first voting starts at the end of January, the beginning of February. And nobody's going to get close to him. No, I'd be surprised if by New Hampshire and Iowa, if any of these Democratic candidates had a million volunteers yet. But Bernie Sanders met that goal in the first week. So he's far ahead of everybody when it comes to the energy and the excitement for his campaign. Again, that is going to be a huge indicator or a huge predictor of what voter turnout is going to be for Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders' ground game, his grassroots network that he started, his movement, I talk about it all the time on this show. Again, that is just unprecedented. 1 million volunteers in a week, but more than that, Bernie Sanders, out of his movement that he started in the 2016 primary, there have been 2 very large and prominent organizations that have been backing progressive candidates across the country, and they're doing it in the name of Bernie Sanders. It's run by people who are close to Bernie Sanders, who worked on his campaign and wanted to continue the movement. So there are these 2 giant political entities, Justice Democrats and Our Revolution, that have been growing their volunteer network. They've been recruiting candidates, and they have an entire political machine that is built on Bernie Sanders' ideology, his policy platform, and his political revolution that he's bringing to Washington, D.C. Bernie has the backing of both of those major political organizations. Who has that? Who has anything close to that? Nobody. So again, like this video started off, the idea, the notion that Joe Biden is somehow leading in this primary just because it says so in the polls is ludicrous. It is insane. And honestly, I cringe when I hear other people in progressive independent media make that point that, oh, Joe Biden is the front runner for now, even if you add the caveat for now, that you still have, the only way you could come to that conclusion is if you disregard all those other factors that I've explained to you, and you also disregard Joe Biden's unique badness and unique shittiness, like the fact that before this primary, he's always been gaffe prone and liable to say stupid shit, and then now the addition of him becoming senile in this primary, you'd have to ignore all of that shit to say Joe Biden is the front runner, just because it says so in the polls. And that's crazy to me. That's crazy to me.